So, quick honesty before we start. I have to ask if you know the true nature of the two voices about to, well, explain AI to you.
Right. The fact that we are ourselves AI.
Yes, exactly. But, a real person actually did the research and wrote every single word.
Yeah. He really does not have the radio voice for it.
Right. So, machine voices, human mind.
Carry on. Welcome to Plain Strata, where we take decentralized AI apart one layer at a time. And we are jumping right in. This is Pulse 2. Today is about the government permission slip that arrived with the world's most powerful new AI model and what the field building an alternative is actually up against.
Right, because we need to look at the concrete scene of what just happened.
Yeah, let us drop right into that concrete scene. Friday, June 26. OpenAI shipped GPT 5.6, and they shipped it in 3 distinct models. You had Sol, which is the flagship. You had Terra, the workhorse model. And you had Luna, the fast and cheap one.
But the catch is with Sol.
Exactly, because accessing Sol requires U.S. government approval. And to be clear, this is not a wait list. It is not some, expensive subscription tier you can just buy your way into. It is a literal government review process. Only 20 companies made the initial list. Everyone else has to wait.
That was the why. The how is the rest of the show, and no background is needed. If you can follow a story, you can follow this.
So the core thesis today is plainly this. The U.S. government became the gatekeeper of the world's most powerful AI this week. And understanding what that means, well, it requires understanding what the field trying to build an ungated alternative is actually up against.
Because if you are listening to this right now, you really need to understand that the rules of the entire industry just changed overnight. It was a massive structural shift.
It really is.
We have to start by examining why the government felt compelled to step into this specific release on that specific Friday. Because, they did not intervene with Terra. They did not intervene with Luna, those smaller models. They intervened specifically with Sol, the flagship.
And it comes down to one test, right?
Yeah, the reasoning comes down to a single metric. GPT 5.6 Sol scored 96.7% on OpenAI's internal cyber attack challenge, which is it is a rigorous test measuring how well a model can plan and execute computer intrusions. Hitting that 96.7% mark crossed a defined threshold for what the government considers a high cybersecurity risk.
Wait, I want to pause on that cyber attack challenge because I am naturally skeptical when I see these numbers. Are we sure this 96.7% is a real threat? Because sometimes, these companies hype up their own safety metrics to make their models look more powerful than they actually are.
It is a common tactic, yeah.
Right. It is a great marketing trick. You tell the government your tool is incredibly dangerous, the government regulates it, and boom, you just built a regulatory moat that locks out all your smaller competitors.
It is a fair pushback, and regulatory capture is a real strategy in technology. We see it all the time. But if you look at the mechanics of this specific cyber attack challenge, the threat is physical, and it is very real. When we talk about planning and executing computer intrusions here, we are not talking about a model writing a simple phishing email with bad grammar.
Oh, so it is not just generating a fake login page?
No, not at all. The evaluation works like this. They give the model an IP address, essentially a target on the internet, and they tell it to find a way in. The model has to autonomously map out the target network. It has to identify obscure vulnerabilities in the existing threat. It has to write a custom exploit for that exact vulnerability. And then it has to execute the intrusion, all without human intervention.
Wow.
So scoring new 97% means it succeeds almost every single time. It moves the model from being, a helpful coding assistant to being a weapon-adjacent instrument.
Okay, so if you were sitting at home, imagine giving a machine a web address, walking away to get a cup of coffee, and by the time you sit back down, the machine has broken into the server, rewritten the administrative privileges, and handed you the keys.
That is exactly it.
That is a 96.7% capability.
Yeah.
That is why the government woke up.
Exactly. The capabilities dictate the response here. Because the model demonstrated that level of autonomous proficiency, 2 specific federal agencies stepped in to manage its release.
And these are heavy hitters.
Very much so. The first is the White House's Office of the National Cyber Director. The second is the Office of Science and Technology Policy. Together, they establish what they are calling a Frontier AI Access Evaluation.
Let us define Frontier AI right here for the listener, just so we are totally clear. At its simplest, Frontier AI is the single most capable AI system available at any given moment. It is a moving target, right?
It is constantly moving. What was considered the frontier 2 years ago is now something you can access on your phone for fractions of a penny. But today, right now, Sol is the frontier.
And I want to dig into the mechanism of this intervention because the structure of it is fascinating to me. The government instituted a permission slip. And the word permission is crucial here. I know you love tracking these terms down to their roots.
I do, because the root tells you exactly what the structure is. The word permission comes from the Latin root permitter, spelled P-E-R-M-I-T-T-E-R-E, but pronounced per-M-I-T-ter-A. It literally translates to letting pass through.
Letting pass through.
Right, so it implies a gate, and it implies a physical gatekeeper who decides what is allowed to pass and what is stopped. The government is acting as the gatekeeper, deciding which 20 companies are let through to access Sol. The government is deciding who gets to pass through the gate and who has to stand outside.
Which feels completely alien compared to the AI export controls we saw back in 2024 and 2025.
Oh, it is a completely different mechanism.
Yeah. Back then, the government drew a geographic line. They enacted policies stopping American companies from selling the most capable models to foreign countries. We even saw situations where a frontier model was switched off for everyone outside the United States over a single weekend. But those were geographic barriers, you know. They were firewalls designed to keep the technology within the borders of the country. What happened on June 26 is completely different. It is a domestic named waitlist.
The distinction is structural, and it is massive. A geographic firewall blocks entities based on where they are in the world. A named whitelist blocks entities based on who they are, regardless of their location. The government is saying that even if you are a company operating in San Francisco, right down the street from the building where the model was built, you cannot use it unless you are on the approved list of 20.
So the gate is not at the border anymore.
No, the gate is at the server rack.
Think about it like owning a printing press. Historically, the best way to understand powerful technology and its relationship to the authorities is the Gutenberg press.
It is the perfect analogy for this.
Right, because once Gutenberg built the press, and once you had the paper and the ink, you could print. You might face consequences after the fact. Maybe the authorities come after you if you print something illegal and distribute it. But the physical act of printing was entirely yours to control. You did not have to ask a government agent for approval before pulling the lever for each new edition.
You held the physical capability.
Yeah. Exactly. What happened on June 26 is the equivalent of the government legally requiring a federal agent to stand in your garage, look at your press, and nod yes before you're allowed to physically press the metal down onto the paper.
That is the exact shift in the power dynamic. The permission structure we saw this week changes the historical dynamic completely. The new structure dictates that even if you own the press and even if you own the paper, there is a mandated approval process standing directly between the machine and the product. You have to ask to lower the press. And OpenAI actually addressed this in their public statement.
They did. They complied with the government, obviously, but they explicitly stated that this government review process should not become the long-term default.
Which is such an interesting tension.
It is a fascinating position because they are the ones who built the model. They are the ones who agreed to the restriction, but they are publicly begging the government not to make this a permanent routine. They are asking the government not to normalize the very power the government just exercised. But honestly, when does a government ever hand back a power it just successfully claimed?
History suggests they rarely do. And the concern OpenAI is raising points back to our core spine for this deep dive. The permission structure is now built. The precedent is set. The government has successfully positioned itself as the gatekeeper of the frontier. And if the government is the gatekeeper, the pressing question becomes how the decentralized AI field can possibly build an alternative that does not have a centralized toggle switch for the government to pull.
So OpenAI just handed the government a toggle switch for the frontier.
A literal toggle switch.
Yeah, and if you are a decentralized builder, your entire existential purpose is to build an ecosystem where that toggle switch physically cannot exist, which makes the quiet, highly technical story that unfolded during that exact same week so shocking. I'm talking about a company called Prime Intellect.
Right. The timing on this was incredible.
It was. Their entire identity is built around decentralized AI. Their mission is to train models across ordinary machines located in ordinary cities, keeping massive centralized data centers completely out of the loop. They want to string together computers over the open internet to build intelligence.
Last week, in the shadow of the GPT 5.6 release, Prime Intellect released a technical report for their newest and most capable model, which they named Intellect T3. The benchmark numbers for this model are incredibly strong. It is a massive leap forward for them, proving they can build highly competitive intelligence.
But here is the contradiction that pulls everything into focus. Intellect T3 was trained on a centralized cluster of 512 graphics processing units. It was trained in one physical room over 2 months. They did not use a decentralized network of home machines. They retreated to a traditional, highly concentrated data center.
They bought a room.
Wait, hold on. If their entire stated mission is avoiding central clusters, why did they retreat into one room to build their best model? Did they just give up on the dream?
They did not give up on the ideology, they collided with physics. The retreat to a single room is the clearest illustration of what the ungated alternative is actually up against. The concentration of AI infrastructure into massive data centers is not an ideological choice made by companies who just love centralization. It is a strict physics problem. Prime Intellect faced a physical constraint that they could not engineer their way out of using decentralized hardware.
We need to go down to the physical reality of what happens when you train a neural network. We need to dip into what you call the communication wall. Because if you're listening to this and wondering why they cannot just use standard fiber optic home internet to link these computers together, you have to realize the sheer volume of data we are talking about.
Let us look at the mechanism, the ocean floor of how this works. Training a neural network is an iterative process of trial and error at a massive scale. You have thousands of processors, and they are all looking at fragments of data, making guesses about patterns, and then calculating exactly how wrong their guesses were. Those calculations of error are called gradient updates.
And they happen constantly.
Constantly. After every single step of training, all those thousands of processors must share their numerical updates with every other processor in the network. They have to synchronize their understanding of the world before they can take the next step.
And a model is not just a few numbers. For a model the size of Intellect T3, which sits at roughly 106 billion parameters, a parameter is essentially a tiny mathematical dial. You have 106 billion dials. The amount of data moving during that synchronization phase is staggering. A single round of updates for a 100 billion parameter model moves roughly 200 gigabytes of data. 200 gigabytes after every single step.
We have to contrast the physical environments where this massive data movement happens. In a centralized cluster, like the one Prime Intellect ultimately rented for Intellect T3, the machines are physically sitting inches from each other. They are wired together using specialized high-speed fabrics. These networking technologies are called InfiniBand and NVLink.
And these are not just fancy Ethernet cables.
No, they are cables and switches designed for one singular purpose, which is moving raw data between chips at tens to hundreds of gigabytes per second. In that highly controlled environment, syncing 200 gigabytes takes milliseconds. The processors share their massive files instantly and immediately move on to the next training step. The hardware is never waiting.
Now look at the decentralized reality. You have processors sitting in people's houses in different cities, connected via standard consumer internet connections. On a good day, an upload speed on a standard consumer network might hover around 10 megabytes per second. Do the math on that. We're talking about syncing 200 gigabytes of data over a pipe that moves 10 megabytes a second. That synchronization process takes more than 5 hours. 5 hours for one step.
The physical reality is punishing. The centralized cluster finishes a training step in a few milliseconds, while the decentralized network spends 5 hours waiting for numbers to cross a wire. During those 5 hours, every single processor in the network is sitting completely idle. They cannot do any new math until they receive the updates from everyone else.
That just stalls out.
Completely. The ratio of communication time to computation time becomes completely inverted. You spend almost all your time communicating and almost no time computing. The decentralized network does not end up being cheaper or faster. It ends up being vastly, catastrophically slower.
But the field is not just sitting still and accepting a 5-hour delay, right? Because there are brilliant algorithms trying to bypass this wall. Prime Intellect themselves pioneered a method earlier this year called DeLoco.
DeLoco is a major piece of this puzzle.
The concept of DeLoco is fascinating. It attempts to manage the communication wall by syncing every few hundred steps instead of every single step. The idea is that you let the processors drift a little bit, you let them learn on their own for a while, and you only pay the heavy communication penalty occasionally. You sync up the class at the end of the day rather than after every sentence.
And DeLoco is a brilliant workaround. Other teams in the decentralized space are trying different architectural tricks too. A group called Pluralis Research uses model parallel approaches. Instead of every machine having a full, complete copy of the 100 billion parameter model, they slice the model into thin vertical pieces across the different machines. Each machine only has to share a very narrow slice of information with the others, which drastically reduces the amount of data crossing the wire.
And another common technique is gradient compression. I want to break down gradient compression because it sounds like magic, but it has a real cost.
It definitely has a cost.
If you have 200 gigabytes of perfectly precise numbers, gradient compression is essentially deciding that you do not need all the decimal points. Instead of sending the full, pristine 200 gigabytes of updates, you send a highly compressed, mathematically approximate version of the updates. You send a blurry JPEG of the numbers instead of the massive raw image file.
That is the perfect analogy. You were sending a blurry JPEG of the math. All these workarounds, syncing rarely, slicing the model, sending blurry math, they sound great in theory, and they actually work reasonably well for smaller models. But they hit a hard quality ceiling. There's a point where syncing rarely, or syncing approximations, starts to permanently degrade the intelligence of the final model.
And this brings us right back to why Intellect 3 was built in a single room. To get Intellect 3 to frontier-level capabilities, Prime Intellect needed to use a training technique called reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is essentially how you teach a dog. The model takes an action, it gets a reward or a penalty, and it immediately adjusts its behavior based on that feedback.
And that reinforcement process completely resists the sync rarely approach of DeLoco. The coupling between the processors and the reward signal is simply too tight. Think about your dog training analogy. If your dog sits, you give it a treat immediately. You do not wait 5 hours to give the dog a treat because the dog will have no idea what it is being rewarded for.
Right, the connection is totally lost.
Exactly. Neural networks operate the same way during reinforcement learning. You cannot wait a few hundred steps to share the reward signal. You have to share it instantly, precisely across the entire network. If you send a blurry JPEG of the reward, the model learns the wrong lesson.
The coupling is too tight, the data is too heavy, and the open internet is too slow. That is the communication wall. When Prime Intellect's goal shifted from proving that decentralized training is theoretically possible as an academic exercise to actually shipping the strongest model available to compete with the big labs, they had to face the physics. They bought a room, they rented the cluster, they paid the physical price to avoid the communication wall.
The retreat to the cluster highlights a specific technical gap in the field. To understand why this gap exists, we need to name and explain a structural pattern in decentralized systems. It is called the oracle pattern.
The oracle pattern.
Yes. The oracle pattern is a foundational concept if you are trying to coordinate trust across a network of strangers. The pattern works like this. You perform the heavy, complex computational work off-site, usually on a central server. You then take the final, verified result of that heavy work and place it on a public, shared ledger. You provide a way for anyone on the network to check the receipt, to mathematically verify that the work was done correctly without forcing them to redo the heavy computation themselves.
I see this all the time in crypto and distributed systems. The oracle pattern works beautifully for AI inference. Inference is when you are just running a finished model to get an answer, like asking it to translate a document or write a poem. You can run the model on a central server, generate the poem, and attach a compact mathematical certificate proving the poem was generated honestly by that specific model.
Exactly, just verify the output.
Right, the decentralized network can quickly verify the short certificate without having to run the massive model themselves. The pattern holds up perfectly there.
It holds up perfectly for inference, but the pattern breaks down completely when you try to apply it to training a frontier model. The gradient sharing, that constant exchange of 200 gigabytes of updates after every single step of training, is too heavy and too tightly coupled. You cannot verify training updates after the fact using a compact certificate. You cannot just post a receipt at the end of the day.
Because the model needs the data to take the next step.
Exactly. The synchronization must happen in real time for the model to actually learn. Right now, to train at the frontier, the oracle physically has to be in the room with the processors. The network wires have to be physically short, and the bandwidth has to be massive.
And we actually have hard data mapping exactly where this wall sits today. An analysis from Epoch AI circulated this week, and it provides the exact coordinates of the physical boundary. Their analysis proves that decentralized training is technically competitive right now for model size between 10 and 40 billion parameters.
Which is a respectable size, but it is not the frontier.
Right. That is the zone where workarounds like DeLoco and gradient compression actually function well without destroying the model's quality. You can send blurry JPEGs of the math for a 30 billion parameter model and still get a smart system.
But the gap between a 40 billion parameter model and a frontier behemoth like GPT 5.6 Sol is massive. Sol is operating on a totally different scale of complexity, likely well over a trillion parameters. The Epoch AI report is so valuable because it places a measurable marker on the communication wall. We know exactly where decentralized training works today, down in the 40 billion range, and we know exactly where it hits the wall and fails.
This brings us back to the honest reality of the dual stories we are tracking today. The U.S. government restricted Sol because it poses a high cybersecurity risk. And honestly, their logic is consistent. If a model can autonomously map a network and write custom exploits with a 96.7% success rate, it is qualitatively different from a model that just helps you write Python scripts. It is a powerful, dangerous instrument.
It is functionally a weapon at that point.
Yeah, so the government's desire to control who gets their hands on that instrument makes logical sense from a national security perspective.
The logic makes sense in isolation. The issue is that policy tends to expand to fit its own logic. The White House explicitly called this a frontier AI access evaluation process. They did not call it a one-time emergency measure. By formalizing the language, they are building a durable structure. They are setting a legal precedent.
They're building a permanent gate.
Because the national security logic is consistent, this permission structure will undoubtedly be used again for future frontier models. Every time a model crosses a certain capability threshold, the government will demand to hold the keys. The baseline for public access to intelligence has been fundamentally reset this week.
And the alternative to this permission structure, the only way out, is a fully ungated, decentralized AI ecosystem. But the hard truth we have to face today is that the alternative is not ready. Prime Intellect proved that when they had to retreat to a centralized cluster to train Intellect 3. If you want frontier capabilities right now, today, you have to build in a cluster.
And a cluster can be gated by a government order. A cluster has a physical location, it has a physical owner, and it has a toggle switch that the Office of the National Cyber Director can reach out and pull.
That is the reality today. But the communication wall that forces builders into those easily gated clusters is a physical constraint. It is not a permanent law of nature. Bandwidth infrastructure improves over time. Standard consumer internet speeds are rising globally. But more importantly, algorithmic research does not stop.
It never stops.
The brilliant engineers working on Doloco and Pluralis are constantly searching for cheaper, more efficient ways to synchronize processors without requiring 200 gigabytes of data to move across a wire every single second.
So what is the milestone we are looking for? The milestone to watch over the next 1 to 2 years is highly specific. We need to watch whether a frontier quality model can finally be trained decentrally without relying on a central room of clustered GPUs. Prime Intellect already moved the bar from impossible to feasible at a moderate scale with their earlier models. The next leap is achieving competitive quality at the frontier scale. We are waiting for the algorithm that completely shatters the communication wall.
And it feels like we are getting closer.
We are. The trajectory of global internet bandwidth improvements, combined with the rapid advancement of low communication algorithms, suggests that moving the wall is entirely possible. The day a frontier quality model is trained without a central room has not arrived yet, but the physics and the math suggest it is a solvable problem. It is an engineering challenge, not an impossibility.
And this is why the mechanics of decentralized AI are so vital to explore right now. It is worth understanding, not because it has magically solved the government gatekeeper problem today. It is not. It is worth understanding because it is the only field actively building the answer to the problem. It is the only field trying to engineer an infrastructure that physically does not have a central toggle switch for anyone to pull.
The government permission slip issued on June 26 made the need for an ungated alternative sharper and more urgent than ever before. The race is now clearly defined. It is a race between the expansion of government access structures on one side and the erosion of the communication wall on the other. This is plain Strata, decentralized AI layer by layer.